right?
let's split this up a little bit then, because we've talked about some administrative functions and overhead. We've talked a bit about what devs and engineers might care about. We've talked about the need for operations. Let's focus on engineering for a minute here. Devs and engineers, how much do they really need to know about Kubernetes and the internals of Kubernetes and how it's really working?
Can we keep that in?
Absolutely.
Sure.
So this is a funny one, right? So, just enough to deploy, right? Like I can make a deployment and I can go. It's right. And my application's running. Maybe that's fine, right? I think it's an interesting place where, some organizations, that line blurs, like who deploys? Is it operations? Is it CI/CD? Or is it an engineer? Who owns that? The really interesting thing is there's a plethora of applications that are trying to capture that space of like taking it away from the engineer so they don't have to know anything about it, right? So there's Draft by Microsoft. I think it came out of Deus. I think it used to be Deus Workflow or something like that. So it's a tool to make it feel more Heroku-like. So there's Draft, there's Scaffold by Google. Waypoint came out recently by HashiCorp, and all these are tools. It's just like, oh, I can just change to my Rails app and say like Waypoint up, and it figures out like, oh, this is a Rails app, and I should make a Docker container and run it in Kubernetes, right? And I don't have to know how it works anymore as an engineer, except for you still kind of do, right? So this is this is for a very specific use case, but until a recent version of Erlang and Elixir, if you ran an Elixir Erlang application in Kubernetes, it could still hog more CPU than you gave it. And it's just because Elixir and Erlang weren't container aware. So just kind of ignored C groups and would just do whatever it wanted, right? And so as an application developer, if you weren't familiar with like how to tune your Erlang or Elixir app, you could put it on a Kubernetes cluster and become a very bad neighbor to all your other pods, right? And so there's still like weird quirks that you do have to know a little bit about where your application's running just to make sure that you can operate it efficiently, right? Like what if I'm running on a read-only file system, right? Like maybe ops has applied that in our pod security policies, and I'm writing stuff to disk because I've always had a disk because I'm in a VM, right? Now it's a different world. Like that disk is going to go away unless I have a stateful set or something.
Right. It does remind me a lot of what at least the good developers would know in terms of interacting with an operating system. They didn't need to know all the guts of Linux or all the guts of Windows to interact with that operating system, but they needed to know enough about the weird quirks and if they were using a framework, how that framework was going to interact with memory and CPU and understand the constraints there, but they didn't need to know how to administer a server. They just needed to know those relevant bits. Does something like the Kubernetes certification for developers help set them up for that type of thing?
I think certifications, across the board can be very helpful to get that grounding, and the basics of what you need in place. But I think just like anything else, especially with Kubernetes, you see a lot of rapid development. I think that's one of the things that's exciting to people and exciting to engineers about getting to work on it. But it also means that you're kind of frequently out of date with things that are happening, and you have to have the time in your day to day to keep up with what's going on. And so I think the certifications are a good way to like bootstrap, but at that point, like things are still happening, things are still changing, and so you have to bake in that time to make it happen. And I think that's also where it then goes and becomes like a bigger concept of the Kubernetes ecosystem. I think a lot of people see Kubernetes as being this, you said operating system. And I think that's what a lot of people see it as, just kind of like the cloud operating system, right? Now I don't need AWS specifics. I don't need GCP specifics. I just have to think about Kubernetes, and it works wherever. But the details are always there, and they're always, you always end up having to know far more than you think about, because every situation is still just a little bit different, and you have to deal with that. And so I think that's one of the biggest challenges that people have is not, it's like some of the XKCD comics and stuff you see about like standardization. It's like, oh, there's too many standards. We're going to make a new one. Everyone's going to use this. And the answer is, well, now you have 16 standards instead of 15. And I think Kubernetes is exactly the same way in that regard.
So you're just saying it should be USB-C everywhere. I think that's That's what I'm hearing.
Right.
Yeah, something you mentioned earlier, and I think it's an important point to draw out here, is that you should really have a solid DevOps practice in place before you try to adopt Kubernetes. And is that to sort of help protect the developers from themselves when it comes to working with Kubernetes?
I think it's to protect everyone, to be honest. You know, if you haven't gotten your culture to the point that you have DevOps kind of baked in and you're doing well with that, then you've added a ton of complexity jumping into Kubernetes. But you've also, kind of like the Unix philosophy, like you've given yourself enough rope to hang yourself, right? You can move very quickly with Kubernetes, and you can do all the wrong things very quickly and end up, as Cory was saying, with workloads running on your cluster that aren't yours because you stood it up and it's there, but you didn't secure it correctly. You don't know how it's tying into IAM. You don't know how all this stuff is done, and you haven't got the culture in place to manage it and to run it and to have that ownership with the shared responsibility model.
I know a lot of people don't like developing in Docker containers, but too bad.